Hey, welcome to Security and GRC Decoded. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy. I'm here today with the awesome Mosi Platt. Mosi Platt is 22 plus years in security and GRC industry, and he's currently a senior security compliance engineer at Netflix. Mosi, welcome.
Good to be here, Raj. I've been talking about this for a long time, so it's good to finally get it started.
Thank you, Mosi. And let's decode. So, Mosi, I want to start off with maybe talking about you. How did you start with security and GRC, and what has been the journey so far?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a convoluted story, but I'll try to give you the short version. So I got first exposed to computers by my aunt, who was the first computer teacher for the public school district in Trenton, New Jersey. And so she was the first, and so she knew a little bit about computers from college, but she didn't really know much. So they gave her computers that she could set up in her own home lab so she could prepare her curriculum and her lesson plans. And she would use her children and her nephews as her first test students. So got exposed to that around 1984, and then moved to Arkansas. My father was in the Air Force. So he was stationed in Arkansas, and that was around the time that Bill Clinton became governor. And so Arkansas had one of the worst educational systems in the U.S. at that time. So it was a big focus of his campaign and his platform. And so the elementary school that I was in also had a computer lab in the gifted and talented classroom. That was the only classroom that had it. And so I happened to be in gifted and talented, and so got to continue learning basic there. And play around with the computer. So that's how I got exposed to it as a kid. And then when I got older, I was far removed from computers. And I was working in a grocery store, actually. And my aunt's husband, my uncle, called me and says, "You're not going anywhere in your life working in these grocery stores." This was post 9/11. And so he said, country's in a recession. The government is trying to get out of it by training IT workers. You should get in this IT training program and have an IT career. And so I enrolled in the program in New Jersey. It was being offered out of the Mercer County Community College. It was called the New Jersey IT Centers. Enrolled in that, and I was still working overnight at the grocery store. And so I would normally sleep through the first one or two classes because I had been up all night working. Yeah. And for the security track, it was split into two parts. In the first part, it was the first class in the morning. And so I'm trying to sleep in the back of the classroom, and the instructor is asking the class a question, and he's a loud talker. You know him, it's John Very from Pivot Point Security, and nobody's answering the question. Every time he repeats it, he says it louder, and I can't sleep because he's so loud. So I answered the question so that he could just bring his voice down to a normal level so I can, get my rest for the rest of the day. And so I answer, he says, "Oh, wow, I can't believe you answered it correctly because you've been asleep this whole time." And so then he just walks over to my side of the classroom and just asks me every question after that for the rest of the class, and I can't go back to sleep. Mm-hmm. So from there, we ended up hitting it off. And when I finished the program in 6 months, he offered me a job in his information security consulting firm, which was called Pivot Point Security. So that's how I got into it. It was really just a string of coincidences.
Interesting.
And so when I joined, I was trained in Windows 2000 network administration. So, and then I had two security classes from John Very. I wasn't really going to be somebody you could send out and build at a high rate for a consulting firm. So my first few projects were related to building out little, networks for small and medium-sized businesses and nonprofits. But why John hired me was because he was getting a lot of work from these nonprofits. He had partnered with his brother-in-law, whose CPA firm, they only specialized in Catholic or religious nonprofits, Indian reservations, and fire districts. And so the AICPA back then had passed this new statement on accounting standards that said that all financial audits had to include an assessment of IT risk. And previously, the CPAs could just say that they assess IT as a maximum risk, but the new standard changed that, where they actually had to do an audit of the IT to support their IT risk assessment. And so he partnered with John Very and Pivot Point to do that for his financial audits that his CPA firm was conducting. So John was getting all this audit work that he could no longer manage by himself. And so he brought me in to either help him continue growing the security work for the business while he did the audit work, or for me to eventually get into the audit work to support that. And so those weren't even really, there was some security aspect for that, but they were integrated audits with financial audits. So they were more like IT audits. Like, how are the financial reporting systems, are they configured properly to ensure the integrity of the financial reports that were being filed? So that's how I got started. And so started with these big Catholic nonprofits. And from there, it was easy to continue billing me out because I had experience from these. It was a low risk environment. Like, I remember, like, John tells a story about one of his first audits with one of these nonprofits. He's asking the CIO, he's going through like the security section of the audit, and the CIO is just failing miserably. Like, he can't answer any question. This is back in like 2002. And then John hits the question, asks him about intrusion detection systems. And the CIO's face just lights up. He's like, oh, yeah. We're good there. We have intrusion detection. And John is stunned because, like, they didn't have a firewall. They didn't have any access control setups. He's like, oh, okay, cool. What do you have for your intrusion detection system? And the CIO responded, we have ADT for intrusion detection. And that's when John was like, oh, man, this is as bad as I thought. So it was really low risk environment to learn in. So it was great. But having the experience with these integrated audits with the financial audits, when Sarbanes-Oxley got passed after the Enron scandal, it was easy to pivot to doing Sarbanes-Oxley IT audit work. So I got into Sarbanes-Oxley IT GRC. I got into IT GRC that way with Sarbanes-Oxley for public companies because we had a client who they had Ernst & Young that was doing their external audit, but they didn't have any IT audit capabilities within their internal audit function. They didn't even have an internal audit function. They outsourced their internal audit. And the internal audit firm they outsourced to didn't have IT audit capabilities because, IT was still new back then. So they brought us in to do the IT audit.
This was when you were at Pivot Point still?
Yeah, it's in Pivot Point. So this is 2000. Now we're in 2003.
Okay.
So that was my first exposure there to do like a really big IT GRC project. And then from there, like Sarbanes-Oxley came out, then PCI DSS came out. And so this same client that we did the Sarbanes-Oxley work for, they owned a bunch of hotel properties. Like, they were real estate investment trusts, and they managed these hotel properties as another part of the business. And so when PCI came out, they were like, hey, well, we also got to comply with this PCI data security standard that's new. And so then I get into the security audits or assessments from the PCI standpoint. And that was my first security GRC project, was PCI DSS compliance. And then from there, building up reps of doing that for a couple of years, and then it expanded. John had the vision that, hey, IT growth is booming. All these companies need to provide assurance to their customers. And so they're only going to have the two main ways to do that are SOC 2 and ISO 27001. And this is around the time when like Thomas Friedman was publishing articles and books about the world is flat. And so John's like, he thinks the SOC 2 is not going to be sufficient if the world becomes flatter. And so in order to provide global assurance, these companies are going to have to start pursuing ISO 27001. And so I pivoted into ISO 27001 and built out the pivot point practice for that. Like John started it with like the first two audits, or helping the first two clients get prepared for a certification audit. And then I kind of took it over and built it out from there. So that's how I got into Security GRC.
Got it.
That's the long, convoluted answer.
That's a fascinating story. I've been on John's podcast, as you know, but I did not know this backstory. That's a fascinating backstory. From a sleeping student to an IT auditor to a security GRC auditor and potentially into assurance. I mean, that's a
Right.
fantastic story.
And I stayed in GRC because when I was doing an audit, John said, well, when are you going to try pen testing? And I was like, sure. I was done with the audit work. So I tried to pen test one of the clients and I was terrible at it. Like, I think I got something from like I found a password for, one employee. And so I got into their email and that was it. That was all I could do after like 6 hours. So I was like, this is an awful experience. I'll stay on the GRC side.
So Mosi, I wanted to sort of, so security in GRC looks like it means many things to many people, right? Why don't we decode that a little bit? What is your definition of security in GRC, security GRC? Can you talk through us a little bit?
Sure. So my security definition is pretty vanilla and straightforward. Especially like when we talk about information security, I'll focus on that. It's the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. Very simple. That's what John taught me. I stick with it to today. That's how ISACA defines it. So that's what information security means to me. The GRC is, well, everyone knows, I think it's short for governance, risk management, and compliance management. And I think the governance part, I think a lot of people they either get confused about or they misuse it to serve their own purposes. And so, governance at a very simple level is just the evaluation, direction, and monitoring of enterprise strategy. Right? That's a really simplified version of the definition from ISACA. Risk management is the identification, analysis, and treatment of the probable frequency and magnitude of future loss. So that's my own hybrid definition. I'm kind of mashing up ISO 27001 definition with a fair definition of risk management. And then compliance management is really simple. It's just ensuring the adherence to relevant requirements. So, the enterprise determines what requirements are relevant. And so that would be part of compliance management, that identification of what requirements do we care about, do we want to provide assurance against.
Got it.
And then just demonstrating that.
You said something very interesting. You said governance, many people misuse. I don't know. Did you say most people misuse? What do you mean by that? Can you double click on that?
So governance is something that comes from, it's top down. And so, there's a lot of discussion nowadays about how do CISOs get to sit at the table with the board or with the, CISOs have C in the title, but are they really part of the C-suite? And so you hear things about like security governance, but if the security executives don't have a seat at the board or the board isn't really evaluating, directing, and monitoring security strategy, that's not really security governance. And so people talk about security governance at a lower level, like from the security executive down. And I know like the ISO standard 27014 makes space for that, but it's not governance in the traditional sense and how it's really thought of in a corporate sense, right? It's not a governing body, right, that is overseeing the management of security. When most people talk about security governance, that's not how it's discussed, because the governing body, security executives don't really have a lot of access to, or the governing body doesn't provide that much oversight to the security executives.
Okay. So the way you described it, if I were to rephrase, governance is about managing the present, risk management is about managing the potential future, and compliance is about reporting. Is that a fair categorization?
The only thing I would change on that is, ISACA does a very good job of distinguishing that governance and management are separate processes.
Yep.
Right. And so just because of that, I wouldn't include management in the definition of governance, because that could lead to confusion.
Got it. So what do you think is happening in the security GRC industry today? It has been a very mature industry, right? But what is your take on it, Mosi? What do you see happening?
So I think we kind of touched on part of it. One big problem, I think one big thing that's happening is this security governance being more myth than reality. I think there's a lot of aspirational security governance where, people talk about it because, they say like work for the job you want, not the job you have. And so I think that kind of influences a lot of what's going on with security governance. People want to, they want to have a seat at the board, or they want to be on the board, right? Or they want to be in that C-suite. And so they talk about security governance as if it's really happening that way, even though it's not. So it's more aspirational. That's one thing that's happening. I think on the risk, security risk management side, I think there's a big struggle to evolve the state of the art from qualitative to quantitative analysis. So, I mentioned I have my own like hybrid definition that, mashes up ISO 27005 and FAIR. But that's kind of even exemplary of that. And so I don't know. I hope it's going to resolve in that we get the state of the art consensus for quantitative analysis. But I've talked with vendors or even standards bodies that are ambivalent, or they don't know how the smoke is going to settle on that battlefield, and so they're just kind of waiting before they move forward to see which way it goes. And then you can even see debates on LinkedIn. Like once you become like a FAIR member or you start following the FAIR Institute online, you just get all of these debates in your feed of people, taking shots at quantitative risk analysis or, or its adherents like, or even creators or thought leaders like Jack Jones or the Scientia Institute, right? Or Doug Hubbard and Richard Syrson, right? And so it's still contested. I don't think that debate has been settled yet. And then on the security compliance management side, it's undergoing digital transformation, but it's a digital transformation that lags behind the digital transformation that IT and engineering went through, right, in the last decade.
Got it. Now, I think you've talked about, do you think the new cybersecurity SEC materiality rules put greater emphasis on quantification? On the risk quantification?
Yeah, so, I would have to say no, because they explicitly state that you can't just use quantitative analysis to meet the requirements, right? And so I would say they don't, but that hasn't stopped risk quants from trying to leverage it and capitalize on it. So like FAIR came out with the FAIR materiality assessment model, specifically intended for compliance with the SEC materiality rules.
Yep.
But the rule itself is very clear, right? Like that's another example of the debate, right? There was a debate about that when they were working on the rulemaking, and they settled on the final language that doesn't stipulate quantitative analysis. So
you're saying that it's still very subjective. It has qualitative and quantitative aspects to it.
Yeah, and and I understand part of it, right? Like you can't just have a purely quantitative analysis for things like that, right? There's qualitative aspect there's qualitative context that needs to be considered, or to put the quantitative analysis in the context, you need a qualitative assessment, right? Or you need to look at qualitative results. So, the SEC was kind of in a tough spot there, but I think the industry, or the practitioners, let me not say the industry, the practitioners need to come to a consensus best practice on how those two go together. And I think that's the tension that's unresolved.
Got it. So I think you talked about some of the challenges with security governance, security risk management, security compliance. How, in your view, how do you think the security and GRC teams and the practitioners should react and adapt to these changes, or to these new challenges?
So, I try to think about these things in terms of people, process, and technology, and then it goes back to my training with John Berry. And so I think from a people standpoint, I think the professionals have to be versatile, right? And And by versatile, I mean they need to have a well-rounded skill set that covers, governance, risk management, and compliance management. So they've got to understand governance. They've got to understand, quantitative risk analysis and be able to put it in a qualitative context. They've got to understand how to identify relevant requirements that not only create value, not only protect the value of the business, but also create value for the business or the organization, right, that they're working for or supporting. So that versatility, I think, is crucial. And another part on that compliance management skill set is, it's harmonizing internal and external requirements, right? Like, how do we make an external requirement relevant internally? And how do we make an internal requirement relevant to external stakeholders? From a process standpoint, I think it's, given the problems with security governance, being a little bit more aspirational than reality, a concrete reality, and security governance is a big input to the risk management and compliance management. I think like any IT or technology problem, input validation becomes crucial, right? Like if your requirements are coming from security governance, but you're getting bad security governance output, you've got to make sure you distinguish the bad output from the good output so that you can actually create a relevant security program, right? So a risk management, compliance management program. So I think that's key. And then, maybe even, and I think what ends up happening with a lot of security programs is when you are providing your own governance input because you aren't getting it from a governing body to provide it. Like who checks the checker, right? Like if you're self-serving your governance, well, who's saying whether or not that governance is appropriate? And I think that's another big problem with security governance being so immature right now. So input validation, right? Like somebody may have to tell the security executive that, I have a colleague that sees this phrase a lot, that their baby is ugly. Like, hey, this strategy is no good. And then DevOps, I think, I mentioned the security compliance management undergoing a digital transformation. I think we know DevOps was a great tool for digital transformation last decade. And I think it needs to be just as vital a tool this decade for security compliance, which means, security compliance got exposed to it in the last decade as they were trying to figure out how they could provide assurance with this new mode of operating. But, I used to have a saying when I was a consultant, like those who can do, those who can't teach, and those who can't teach audit. And so I think compliance professionals need to make that transition from being able to audit something to being able to do something when it comes to DevOps. And I think that is the tough part of the digital transformation and security compliance right now. And then from a technology standpoint, I think security compliance or security GRC programs, they need flexible platforms they can work on because they have to cover the three lines, right? They've got to cover the first line, the second line. The first line would be the operators. The second line would be the compliance professionals who are evaluating the output from the operations teams to hold them accountable. And then the third line is providing assurance to the stakeholders, right, at the governing body level, which would be your board, your executive management, your external stakeholders. And those three lines work very differently, right? Like first line is in the weeds. Second line, they have that 10,000 foot view. They tend to be more jack of all trades, know a little about a lot. And then the third line is very focused, right? They only care about what they need to care about. Like, what do they absolutely need to trust for the decision that they need to make with the assurance that they're given? And that's all they care about. And so because of those different approaches, is how they like to work in the GRC. With GRC information is very different. And so the platforms need to be flexible enough to allow that.
Got it. So if somebody were to ask you, how would you build a security GRC program today and add assurance to it, right? How would you build a program today? Then what is typically being taught, or what is the common knowledge? What would your answer be to that?
So my my first response would probably be like a muscle memory, like a reflexive response, because I did it so much when I was a consultant, and so it's still my default. And so it's really just a simplified version of the management processes that they outline in ISO 27001 standard. And so the way I simplify it is you've got to have, for any security GRC program, needs to have these 7 simple business processes in order to provide assurance and build trust with stakeholders, right? So you got to have context. So you got to understand what you're securing and why. Secondly, you've got to have leadership, right? You've got to have a vision. So okay, this is the thing we're trying to secure. How should it be secured, right? In order to satisfy our why. And so, that typically gets expressed in things like, security policies, allocation of roles and responsibilities and things like that, right? So now you know what you need to secure. You understand how it should be secured. Then you come in the next process, which is planning, which is how do we implement this vision for how we should secure our information? And right now, where we are in our state of practice, it's typically risk-based planning, right? I think that needs to evolve to be trust-based planning, but we're immature in that. We don't have we don't really have a consensus best practices for doing that right now. So that's something that's in development, but you've got to have either risk-based or trust-based planning process that identifies what your objectives are for implementing this vision of security. Once you have your planning, your next process is support. What do we need to have in place to execute this plan for the Security GRC program, right? And so that needs to cover things like what resources are required for the people that are going to be executing this plan, what competencies are required, what awareness do the stakeholders need to have of this program as we execute this plan, what communication needs to be in place to keep the practitioners and the stakeholders in sync, and then what documentation do we need to have as records so everyone can at any time come and get the information that they need as to execute this plan. You've got that in place, then you can get into the operations of it. This is simply the execution of the plan, right? You know what you need to do to implement the security vision. You've got the support in place to execute it, and now it's just go executing it, right? And that's just your standard project management, right? After your operation process, you have to have a performance evaluation process that says, hey, how well did we do implementing this vision for security GRC that was set by leadership? And then the final process is improvement, which says where you fell short of implementing the vision, you have corrective actions or continuous improvements to close that gap. And then if things changed in the context from the time you started executing the plan to the time you did your performance evaluation, well, what other improvements do we need to make or changes do we need to make to account for the changes in context? And those those 7 processes are, cyclical, and sometimes they run in parallel. But if you have those 7 processes, I think you can build out a pretty effective security GRC and assurance program. And I think one thing that's different we already talked about is, we should try to shift from a risk-based plan to a trust-based plan. Mm-hmm. I'll explain why I think that's an important shift that needs to be made.
Yep.
I think what really got me thinking about, I've always thought about this. There's this open source security testing methodology manual from ICECOM and Pete Herzog. And so I want to say it was probably version 3 or 4, they introduced these trust principles into the OSTEM. And I thought it was fascinating. And then they came up with a trust score. And the way they articulated it, it made so much sense. Because assurance is about trust, but we focus on, focus on risk, the risk side of it, we're focused on we're building people's trust by giving them assurance that the bad things that can happen are sufficiently diminished, right? Or controlled, as opposed to telling them, which is kind of an indirect way of providing building trust. Whereas why not just have a direct way of building trust by, hey, what do you need to trust this output, and tell you whether or not that what you need is what you got.
Interesting.
And I think that becomes really important now with artificial intelligence, right? Because if it's so with these Gen AI models, right? If the large language models or the neural networks operate in sort of a black box, and it's not really understood how the output is created, right? But we need to trust the output. Well, trying to focus on a risk-based approach to that could be a never-ending exercise. But we can absolutely enumerate what we need to trust the output.
Can you elaborate on that? Why do you think it's going to be a never-ending exercise?
Well, I mean, because if it's a black box, if you're getting output from a black box, how can you enumerate all of the risks?
You don't know.
Right, right. And so it becomes insufficient.
Got it.
From a security management standpoint, right? Like, you'll never really know if you did a good job managing the risk. And so how much assurance can you provide, right? I think it'll always be questioned. Whereas if you take that trust-based approach and you just start with, this is what I know I need to trust it. And you can debate whether or not that trust whether you set the right level of trust, right? But that's on the stakeholder, not on the trust provider, right? So I think it becomes more management. I think it becomes more realistic. And then the other thing I think that gets lost when building out or operating security GRC programs is value creation. I think gets lost. Security in general tends to over-index on value protection, but no business survives on protection alone, right? At some point, the business needs to create value to survive, and security is no different. If security is not creating value, then at some point, and sometimes, some security programs struggle with this now, right? They find themselves, finding it hard to justify their existence, right? Or at the very least, their budget, right? So you're finding ways to focus on value creation, and that goes back to that context process of understanding the why, right? And if that why needs to be focused on both value creation and protection, and if you have that, then it should be easy downstream to focus on value creation throughout those other 6 processes.
Got it. And by value creation, do you mean both internal and external? So, for example,
right.
customers.
Value creation, right. How do you create value for all the stakeholders, right? Yep. And I think of stakeholders I got this from Harvard Business Review. But you have stakeholders could be shareholders, right? Would be one set of stakeholders. The communities that the enterprise operates in is another set of stakeholders. The vendors and partner ecosystem that all enterprise need to deliver their services would be another stakeholder. The employees themselves is one set of stakeholders, and then the 5th one I am drawing a blank on. Is the governing body, right? The board, right? In the executive management. So. I'm sorry. I left out customers. Customers is the one that I left out. And so how do you create value for all those stakeholders? Right. So, because if you're internal employees, if you're not creating value for them, why are they going to keep working to deliver the services to satisfy those external stakeholders? Right. Yep. So I think you have to have a balance.
I think those are very interesting insights, Mosi. Trust-based and not just risk-based. I think there may be an intersection, but your point is fundamentally shift your perspective on how you want to manage the security GRC program. 2 is focus on not just value protection, which even then sometimes is very difficult to articulate today, but focus also on value creation, and not just for internal stakeholders, but also for external stakeholders. I think that's brilliant. Do you have any insights in terms of how you would go about sort of thinking about that trust-based, risk-based, and value creation?
So for trust-based, risk-based, the trust-based side is still immature, but it is developing. Like ISACA came out with this digital trust framework, I want to say 2 years ago, they launched it. And so I think that's a start. The OSS TMM has their trust assessments that they've created. But I don't think we've gotten to, like I said, a consensus best practices yet. And I think both of those things were created, while created to be flexible. I don't think we have enough. I don't think we've had enough practice yet to determine if they hold up when applied to artificial intelligence. Right? Like, are they actually valuable in creating trust in these systems, in these processes that we need? So I think we just need more time to apply them, and then fine tune them, right, and improve them so that we can actually get to some consensus on the trust-based versus the risk-based thing. But those are the places where I would start if I wanted to apply a trust-based approach.
Got it. I think those are fantastic insights, Mosi. And I think one challenge, I think anybody listening to this program is going to be, how do I get the money, resources, time, budget, and all this, right? So how do you go about convincing the security leaders and executives, right, on how to go about such a program? Any advice on insights there? How do you build a business case?
Yeah. I think the first thing I always go back to when it comes to building a business case is, and this may seem very basic and simple, but sometimes, they like, I had some family members say common sense ain't always common, but is lead with truth and not hyperbole. And I learned that lesson the hard way in a consulting engagement. We were consulting for a municipal agency that they handled. They provided the financial services for the municipality. So they handled the financial service, the fintech for the municipality, right? All the financial services technology this agency was responsible for. And so they were replacing the financial management system for the municipality. And so we came in and did a security assessment of it, including a pen test. And the pen test, we got root at every level of the stack. And in my controls assessment, I found like big time deficiencies in the change management process. And so we're writing, I write up the audit report. I had just gotten my CISA, my Certified Information Systems Auditor certification from ISACA, and I'm fresh out of the classes, and so I'm CISA by the book. And one of the things they teach you is the purpose of the audit report is to shock management into action. And so I write this inflammatory audit report, and I had even the fonts for each section, they were like 24-point fonts for the section headings, just to shock management into action. And so John tried to tone it down a bit, but I'm hitting him with CISA practice book chapter and verse, and he's like, okay, all right, we'll try it. And and even the contractor that brought us in, because we were subcontracted, they looked at it and they were like, hey, look, the guy's got a point. Look, you have root on the admin desktops. Like, this, the system's owned from end to end. Like, maybe this is what it needs to be. And so we go into the meeting, and somebody some of the executives in this meeting opens up the report before the meeting starts and flips to the table of contents and says, oh, this is going to be a fun meeting. And then someone else says, you think the first page of the table of contents is interesting. Wait till you see the second page. And then one of the key stakeholders turns to the executive for the agency. I'm sorry, the executive for the agency turns to one of the stakeholders for the project, the one that was actually funding it, and said, you set me up, because they're the ones that brought us into the assessment. And so the meeting went terribly. So after the meeting, like, it's me, it's John, and it's the project manager who brought us in. We're sitting and we're having like Glenlivet scotch to come up with a rescue plan. Like, how do we rescue this engagement? And I remember the project manager wrote down on a napkin at this bar, Glenlivet rescue plan, or Glenlivet plan. And we sketched it out. But and it worked. We ended up, getting things back on track. They ended up not kicking us out, and they kept bringing us back for more work. And when I came in for the second engagement, I was really nervous because I hadn't really seen anybody since the first one, had like, kind of went down in flames in that meeting. They got hostile. And the assistant executive director introduced me to the technology leader for this new project we're working on. And she says, I want to introduce you to Mosi. And here's what you need to know. Mosi will always tell you the truth, even if it's not in his best interest. Because his little firm came in here and they gave us a report that was politically awful, but they told us the truth anyway. Even it could have cost them all millions of dollars in business with the municipality. So you can always trust what they say is going to be the truth. So that's the first step, I think, is lead with truth. You're always going to be in solid ground, even if it's painful, right? And in the end, when that truth resonates, right, people will know what they need to do and understand it. So while my execution of shock management into action could have been better, in the end, it did get management to take action, right? So lead with truth, not hyperbole. So that's why I should have toned it down a bit, because I really like amped it up. It was like reading like tabloid headlines. It was awful.
No need to use tasers.
Exactly. So I think, lead with truth and not hyperbole. But the other thing is, and I think what really saved us, is we didn't just go into that meeting with these inflammatory headlines, but we had solutions that we proposed for those identified problems. And so, so never, if you're leading with truth and that truth may be painful to swallow, don't bring someone a problem without a solution, right? And I hear from other colleagues that happens a lot in these meetings where people are trying to present to executive teams, where the first question is, so what? What do I do about it? Right? And then the response could be like hemming and hawing, or well, it depends, right? I think you got to have a clear solution that you propose. And then the final thing is, I think you've got to be able to demonstrate value creation from that solution, whether it's direct or indirect. So whether it'll directly address some some customer security requirement, right, for a deal that you really want to close, or that's important for a group of customers, a class of customers, or accounts that are important to the organization, or if it's indirect value, where it will indirect value that will enable people to move up the value chain, right? So, like, especially we talked about compliance going through this digital transformation, and a lot of people try to think about it in terms of automating manual processes, right, for the purpose of saving time, right, and eliminating redundant tasks or tedious tasks. And I don't really think that the value there comes from the elimination of time. And not that there isn't some value there is, but I don't think anybody can really communicate it very well, because like none of us are really punching the clock, right? So we don't have good mechanisms for tracking time spent.
Exactly.
And I've tried a lot of them as a consultant who worked on billable hours, like everything from having like things that monitor how long I had executables running or windows open on my laptop to, starting timers in Jira tickets, right? So nobody has that. So that data is not reliable, or it's only reliable to a certain extent. But I think the value of it comes from elevating people from to a higher level of work. So, for example, instead of just collecting, like the mundane task of collecting evidence from a system, elevating them from doing the collection to doing the evaluation of the evidence, right? So just instead of just providing, evidence that the information exists, an evaluation of what is the information telling us,
Yeah.
right? Like, where's the signal in all this noise?
Got it.
And what should we do about it? And then that kind of reinforces the other thing of now maybe you can propose a better solution if you have a better sense of the problem that was identified in the evidence you collected, right?
Got it. No, I think that is very, very interesting, Mosi. So what would you say to somebody who's inheriting a program, right? I mean, this has been there happening for some time. Now you're asking them to sort of change the tires while driving, right? How they inherit and how they go about this?
I think so. One thing I started to realize, and this was, this realization kind of started in conversations with you. It's probably 18 months ago now. Is I realized, like, okay, a tool I needed a better tool or a better approach to identify where the security compliance program is and where does it need to be. And a lot of times that looks like a maturity model, but the maturity model wasn't really sufficient for the answers I was looking for, the insights I was looking for, like maybe the context I was looking for. So as I was thinking about it, I thought about it in this idea of these 4 quadrants of security
I
compliance.
think I've seen
programs.
it before. The static and the friendly and the adversarial and the friendly and the static and the dynamic assessments.
Right. Yeah. So there's the axis of engagement and environment, right?
Yeah.
And so how does the third line engage with the compliance program? Is it adversarial or is it friendly? And
Yeah.
then what is the environment for the scope of the compliance program, right? Is it a static environment or is it a dynamic environment? And thinking of it that way gave me a better way to figure out, okay, this is what the program was designed for. And is that still fit for purpose? And if not, why not? And what is? And so I think a lot of organizations, their compliance programs were, created in the time where the environments were static, right? Like I remember, like I was saying about like that municipal, I started out like financial reporting systems, right? Doing IT audits for them. And it was routine that the best practice was you don't update the revenue generating systems, but once a year. Right. And everything was designed to not touch the revenue generating systems unless it was absolutely necessary. And so like a lot of compliance programs were built around that mindset is these are the sensitive systems for compliance. And so we don't touch this environment. The whole goal is to control it to the point that nothing changes because every change leads to all this additional compliance work.
Yeah.
But now that we went through digital transformation, right, we introduced these different concepts of working, from waterfall to agile and DevOps. The environments become more dynamic. They went from being, these controlled systems in someone's building to these systems in someone else's building managed by their staff, right? Up to a certain point of the stack. The things have become more dynamic and the compliance programs need to adjust with that. And also it went from, I talked about how when I first got into Security GRC, and the decision for the consulting firm was to focus on ISO 27001 because the world was becoming flat from a global business standpoint. That also adds dynamism to the environment, right? So instead of just having to comply with domestic requirements for doing business, now you have to comply with international requirements for doing business. Or if you're looking to expand into other markets, well, what are the requirements for those markets? Or if you're trying to grow your total addressable market to different customers, well, what are the requirements for those customers as compared to the typical customer that the business was created to serve? So all that dynamism, I think, you have to understand that, and if you don't, then you'd be tough figuring it out, or it'd definitely be tough to figure out how you create value if you don't understand why what trust people need from your program in the first place.
Absolutely. I think there is a lot of wisdom that you packed in there, Mosi. And if somebody wants to look at that, is there a place where they can go look at the 4 quadrant matrix?
Yeah, so I did a presentation with my boss at Netflix, Charles Nawatu. We did a presentation for Cybersecurity. They do this Engage speaker series, and so you can go to their YouTube channel.
And we'll put a link on the podcast. But thank you. That's sort of actually fantastic, Mosi. I sincerely appreciate it. What would you tell the younger self, Mosi, or I think sort of differently put, right? If for a new person who's entering into the security and GRC program, to the security compliance engineer, to the GRC analyst, what would your advice be, right? And where can they get started, especially in an environment where they say we have it all automated, right? To the example that you were giving earlier, right? We have the intrusion prevention system, the things like that. What do you advise them? Where can they get started?
I would, if they have everything automated and they passed the audit, right? And as far as they're concerned, or maybe as far as their bosses are concerned, right? Everything is good with compliance. I think I would, now you can take things to another level, right? And now you can start to pivot to some of these areas or these ideas that we talked about that are less mature or less understood or practiced. Like, can you pivot from a value protection model to a value creation model, right? Yep. So how do you make your program more valuable? How do you drive things forward for your stakeholders in terms of providing value to employees, customers, suppliers and partners, shareholders and communities? And another thing I would do is if you've got everything automated and you're passing the audits, then maybe you can also try to make that pivot from risk-based to trust-based, right? Like if you got a good handle of controlling things from going wrong, how do you get assurance that things are going right?
Yep. No, I think that is fantastic, Mosi. And we are approaching almost at the end of the program. And given sort of all the wealth of the experience that you have, if you were to dream of a security GRC solution, what would that look like? What would those attributes be?
So I think it kind of goes back to one thing I said earlier is at a fundamental level, it would have a user interface and a user experience that engages those key stakeholders where they like to work, right? So that first line, second line, and third line that we talked about, those like employees, shareholders, communities, suppliers, it would start there, customers. And that is an ambitious ask in and of itself. I know that's like a utopian idea that you serve all those different populations in a way that makes them all happy. But that would be my dream. So that's one thing. And then more specifically, I think about it in the terms of those 7 processes. And so like from a context standpoint, I would love to have like sensors that, gather and process contextual information, maybe in a way similar to what we see with threat intelligence services. They're taking this ocean of information and then it distills it down into things that are relevant. So I would love to have something automatically sense and gather context and distill it for the
separate the signal from the noise.
Yes.
Separate the signal from the noise.
That's right. And then, but broader than just like threat intel, things like, hey, like when we talk about those 4 quadrants, like what are changes in the environment, right? What are some regulatory issues that are going on? Or what is these customer complaints in this region?
Got it.
Where do we see moments of truth failing, right? And we want to change the trust narrative there, right? All of that kind of context, right? At a business or organizational level and community level. So from a leadership standpoint, I would love to have a platform that had, workflows that made it simple for leadership to adjust strategy, make additions to the strategy based on that distilled contextual information that we got now from this dream platform. And I would love it if we could even automate, the recommendations for, policy positions or allocation of roles and responsibilities, right? Like hopefully from some trusted AI source. From a planning standpoint, I think this is a dream, but even in my dream is still limited, anchored in reality a little bit. I would love to have workflows in the system to support quantitative risk and trust management. Because I don't think we're settled there yet. I'll pick quantitative over qualitative, and maybe in my dream it'd be something to kind of mash together the FAIR controls analytics model and the open source security testing methodology manual, trust principles approach,
Yep.
or trust assessment approach. Maybe something mashes those together, and of course, automated recommendations for like objectives and key results to measure the risk and trust management. I think would be fantastic. From a support standpoint, I would want integrations out the wazoo, right? Like integrations with the accounting system so that we can, for our resource management, a procurement platform, the HRIS, for their resource and competency management. Whatever the communication platforms are for the business, so like the email platform, the chat ops platform or collaboration platforms, the knowledge management platform, so that I can cover the awareness, comms, and the document management, right? So I would want integration with those. For operations, I would want to have an integration with the project management system, right? So that if people have a way they like to work, the system doesn't step on their toes with that, right? It fits right in. And then for performance evaluation, nowadays the talk is like data fabrics. So, it's got to have like a data fabric and some business intelligence for metrics and reporting, because, we're dealing with a lot of data. And like you said, we've got to find a way to get signal out of all the noise. And then from an improvement standpoint, just a workflow for corrective actions and continuous improvement where it's got that human in the loop where maybe it's an automatically generated recommendation and remediation where possible, right? If we really got our stuff together, our asset management and configuration management together. But that human in the loop that says, yes, this is what we want to do, or tweak it as possible before we push those changes, into operation.
You definitely do have a dream. I think you dream a lot, Mosi. I mean, I was not expecting you gave me a scientific breakdown of sort of your dream GRC solution. That's fantastic, Mosi. I love it. It's almost like you want to build an autonomous GRC solution. That's what it looks like. Or an agentic GRC platform.
Yeah, right. But with agentic with humans in the loops at these key checkpoints.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, Mosi, I think this has been a lot of fun, and I wanted to sort of end the podcast with this question. I know you're a fantastic reader. You're a voracious reader. Are there any podcasts, audiobooks, books that you read, listen, that you can share with our listeners, and why? And what is that is? I mean, maybe if you can describe why you like them. I think a few of them that would be super helpful.
Sure. So, I think these days I'm more of a voracious listener than reader, because a lot of my consumption is switched to audio. But from a book standpoint, I think, we talked about security compliance undergoing its own digital transformation and, how that's been influenced. It needs to follow some of the lessons learned from DevOps. I think there's IT Revolution has a great book on that, Investments Unlimited, from the same group that published the DevOps Handbook, the Phoenix Project. I think the Investments Unlimited book is excellent. And then from a book standpoint, I have a fiction book that I always recommend to people. It's a short story by my currently favorite sci-fi author, N.K. Jemisin. It's called Emergency Skin.
Uh-huh.
And it's a short story about a human who comes back to Earth after her people have left the Earth because of climate catastrophes and just general degradation of living conditions on the planet. And they come back to the planet for resources. And it's a short story about what they find when they come back. And I won't ruin it for anybody, but it's just an amazing story about what humanity is capable of with cooperation. And it's also wickedly funny because that's why I recommend the audiobook, because the narrator just the way they intone certain phrases, it's I don't know. I think they had to intend for it to be comedic, but it's hilarious. There's some of the things that the human that comes back, they have an AI assisting them on their trip. And so the things that the AI says to the human is just hilarious that you have this machine's perspective and this human perspective.
And when was this book written, do you know?
Oh, this probably came out 3 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay.
It was Audible commissioned this series of short stories, and so they were marketing it, and so they pushed it to me in my Audible app, so I stumbled on it. But it's fantastic. Really, the jewel of it is the story about what is capable when humanity cooperates, and so I think that's an inspiring story. And then, like I say, I do more listening than reading, so I'm big on podcasts. And so I think the podcast, from a security standpoint, the podcast I probably get the most from is Enterprise Security Weekly, which the main host is Adrian Sanabria. And so they do a great job of, reporting on the industry in terms of startups, acquisitions, mergers. But then they also summarize, articles about thought leadership. And now they've expanded it with, I think Darwin Salazar is his name. So now that he's been added, they also cover reporting on product or technology capabilities, announcements. So like new products, new features. Darwin does a great job bringing that. So it's a really comprehensive podcast that really keeps me up to date on where things are in the industry and from a practitioner standpoint. And then I think to complement that is the Center for Internet Security started a podcast, which they have now over 100 episodes of, is Cybersecurity Where You Are. And, I think I've talked earlier about meeting people where they're at, where the stakeholders are. And so that's kind of the intent of that podcast, and that's how they talk about cybersecurity. And I think they do a fantastic job of it.
Got it.
Sean Atkinson is the CISO there, and he's one of the smartest people I ever worked with.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In cybersecurity. So
absolutely. I think Mosi, we will get the links from you, and we'll put them on the podcast, the comment section. Mosi, thanks for being part of the Security and GRC, and you have truly decoded Security and GRC. I think it is nothing short of an inspirational podcast for me, and I'm sure our listeners will agree as well. So thank you very much for
Thanks for letting me ramble on, Raj. I appreciate it.
That is absolutely.